It's a pleasure to bring up this last session of what's a very intense day or afternoon even, but it's a very sort of, there's an awful lot of thinking that's gone into this whole sort of reflection, and you are getting an awful lot of information translated across in a very short space of time. So we do finish off with this topic, enabling and leveraging research and innovation in regulatory science, and it's one of these it's one of these strategic goal areas it's the same as in the human reflection in this area, but not only that, a lot of the core recommendations and underlying actions are actually very aligned. So essentially, if you were at the human workshop a few weeks ago, you'll largely hear the same sort of pitch, as it were. But having said that, though, the devil in the detail, it's when you drill down a few levels, then you'll see the fact that the needs in the veterinary area is somewhat different to that in the human, although not exclusively. And this isn't me not spinning it out, Ivo. It's just by way of introducing the panel. We have a select panel. We have the smallest panel of the day, but I'm very happy to be supported by Jean-Charles Cavitte, coming in from DG AGRI. And insofar as I understand, he's the man with the money. That's why this man on this side was very interested about him in terms of funding these various research proposals. And he also is operating with some blessing from our RTD colleagues who couldn't, unfortunately, join us here today, but they're very much aware of that Jean-Charles was making himself available and then will help the discussion with his own reality in terms of what goes on day by day. And we are also being very economic or ergonomic, and we're recycling Professor James Wood for a second time, who's also going to join us on this panel. You might as well make use while we can. And I have my colleague Valentin Nicorescu, who will then help us out during the Q&A session. So that's just by way of heading up what's to come. Okay. So again, just leave it at the introduction, and just at the very highest level, what the hell is this thing all about? It is very much this agency and this network system trying to look outside of itself and leverage and engage with a community that, although we have had ambitions and some sort of levels of contact, tangential, peripheral, whatever, we would like to do more of going into the future. And that's why this is a regulatory science reflection. This is a sort of proposal starter for 10. It's an area that we think we could do a lot better on as an agency, both in the human and in the vet sector. And I was struck then with Ivo at his introductory remarks. He was saying that we should mobilize forces outside of the network to help us do our business, looking and developing the various regulatory tools, which, for lack of knowledge, we currently don't have, and that can only be a beneficial thing. I was also very struck then by Jean-Pierre Aron's intervention, saying that, to strengthen the regulatory capability and the transparency thereof, it's already in the Network 2020 strategy, but it's something that is, yet to be fully delivered, and we believe we can, as I say, do a better job building on whatever's been achieved to date in the years to come. Next slide, please. Okay, so if you just throw that down, just build it all up. Yeah. Okay, thank you. Essentially, why do we think this is such a good idea to do? And basically, if you just look at the three bullets there, it's I think there's a legitimate expectation from all stakeholders is that regulators should apply cutting-edge regulatory science to the review and the approval process. And again, that takes us back very much to Ivo in the session one with that sort of, which way do we look at is regulatory science the bedrock, the underpinning of the guidance, scientific advice and licensing decisions, or is it the nice thing to do at the weekend, the cherry on the cake? And I think we're moving to a situation, maybe it's an evolution or a maturation in the European system where we very much believe it's driving, and it should actually be the bedrock on which we build. Be continuously informed of scientific innovation relevant to regulatory decision-making. That takes us back to Guido Rassi's point. He's a very busy guy. He's always flying around the world. He just came back from Boston this morning, so he might have been a wee bit jet-lagged when he was making his intervention. But indeed, he does see a lot of this global, and there's a lot of discussion now about this horizon scanning. How do, health systems generally make room for this innovation? Because, the challenge is there, but we all know budgets and pricing, reimbursement, etc. is tight in all situations. It's even tighter in the vet situation vis-a-vis the human. But at the end of the day, though, the expectation is that we want to onboard this innovation to some extent. So to some extent, we should also be flagging or signposting this to the various downstream decision makers accordingly. And then the last one is we want to capitalize on our framework for collaboration, to articulate the regulatory needs and challenges. Now, articulate is a lovely word in the English language. It's depending on which dictionary you look, it's to express clearly and effectively. And what that means is we should express clearly and effectively what we want or what we need. And I think we can sort of make a collective admission to date, well, certainly inside this house, if not in other areas across the network as well, we haven't been so good at articulating those needs so explicitly, such that the various research community funders, etc., can rise up and address that or engage with that and get more translational research that really then helps us doing our business and the variety of challenges that we've just actually covered throughout the course of the session this afternoon. So that's the sort of the why. Yeah? So we'll go on to the next slide, please. So we've come up with these sort of core recommendations, and as I say, they're pretty much in common with the human area, but no harm for that. And the first one is developing network-led partnerships with academia to undertake fundamental research in strategic areas of regulatory science once we know what they are. And network-led partnerships, I mean, there is an ambition behind that. And I think Jean-Pierre described, some of the work that's been done nationally in the French situation, and we know in the human area, there's other similar, very good national type activities there. And it's not necessarily to say that we should substitute for that, but we certainly should complement it. And anything that's done at the national level should then be syndicated across Europe, and we should take benefit from that and maybe even coordinate the planning and the input of that in a better way than we've managed to date. We do also have an ambition to leverage collaborations with academia and network scientists, and there we're talking about the guys in the NCAs and here, etc., to address rapidly emerging regulatory science research questions. And you might say, well, that sounds awfully similar to the very first point, but the very first point you have to think is, I describe it as the motorway. It's the sort of 4 to 5 year time horizon, really basic fundamental type research or translational research. Whereas occasionally within the regulatory system, we have the need for something a little bit more target, a little bit more rapid with a 1 to 2 year sort of time horizon that we might need to directly commission ourselves. So it's not quite a motorway, it might be a byway or a secondary road, as it were, but there is a need for us to develop our capability in that area. The next two slides to identify the next two recommendations to identify and enable access to the best expertise across Europe and internationally. And I think that's, I think Jackie Atkinson was highlighting that we really do. And in particular, it's rather funny because the vet industry, insofar as I've seen it, they seem to express the globalization of their development efforts even stronger than the human. And that's a personal surprise to me. I have a human background, but it's a very strong expression. And therefore, the drive for us as regulators, etc., to foster that engagement. And we got the message, it's not just with FDA, that's appreciated, but we need to go beyond. I mean, that's pretty much clearly delivered. Finally, then we have the disseminate and exchange knowledge, expertise, and innovation across the networks and stakeholders, and that is all about capacity building. Let's not shy away from the fact, we have our UK colleagues making an absolutely massive contribution within our network system. To date, it's of the order, a rough order of magnitude of about 20%. The idea of losing that anytime soon doesn't make the job any easier. Let's see where the politicians leave us in X weeks, years, months to come. But even Europe as a whole, with the ability to reach out at Europe and internationally, we'll have to address these challenges as best we can, and also then remember the global context. So that's the core recommendations. We develop it a little bit more in the slides to come, and I can skip through that reasonably quickly in a sense. So this is, the first one here is the network-led partnerships. I suppose this then would be the motorway, the sort of, the classical thing that we would like to proactively engage with DG Research and Innovation, DG Sante, and the various member state funding agencies, and because they exist, to collaborate with those, to issue calls to establish these research collaborations. And this is recognizing we've limited resources within the network itself, but at least we have a responsibility to articulate what those research needs are, and then hopefully these guys can actually take them up and ensure that they get proposed and funded to a greater or lesser extent. Jean-Charles already made the observation, where's DG AGRI when it comes to this slide? I'm waiting for you to say that in the response, but I'll just leave you there. I know it's coming, but hey, we're not being comprehensive here. By and large, we're happy to work with wherever the money is. We'll go where the full of the money, And in terms of research topics, there's a number that are thrown up there, but I also picked up, we could go back to what's discussed this afternoon, the 3 Rs discussion. Mums was mentioned repeatedly saying, it's not financially viable, don't expect the industry to do that all alone. All sorts of things about new technologies. And the other thing that was a very strong, and again, maybe somewhat surprising in the vet, even more so than the human, was this business of social sciences and the communication of risk benefit, the whole, the true story behind the AMR and the animal contribution to that, which maybe, and I think Nancy was referring to that at the beginning. So there are a number of areas, without a doubt, that research, fundamental research, translational research would actually help us do our business. Next slide, please. That's really just the sort of model with regards to the time, but I'll skip over that just for the sake of time again. The second one then, this is the byway as opposed to the motorway. It's whereby us, the agency, EMRN is this little acronym, the European Medicines Regulatory Network, where we might have more rapid regulatory science questions that we might need to answer more quickly. And there we have an existing sort of capacity to commission that type of research with a 1 to 2 year sort of time horizon. So that is not competitive to the primary offering that the RTD, AGRI, whatever offer. It's more, complementary to it and simply driven by a time horizon. And I know Professor Woods was talking about, the need to educate, veterinarians and sort of, the grassroots type of guys, in terms of improving adverse event reporting, whole attitudes, a culture mind shift. And there is this feeling that in both of these areas, but maybe more in this sort of byway type route, that we really could, with taking placements of national experts and having placements from academics actually coming here to the agency for periods of time, that can actually sort of embed that sort of training and learning of the next generation of scientists that are being emerging from the system, no matter what end of the business they end up, regulated, whatever. Next slide, please. Okay. The business about the expertise, I already mentioned the challenge of as we go through, navigate the next few years. And I mean, there is, because of the sort of the specialization in the innovation that's coming in, the idea of having that each, various national agencies will have the perfect experts sitting in an office just waiting to be activated, that's increasingly unrealistic. And it's far better than to reach outside of our agency structures, more into like university hospitals, whatever, people that are more in the front line of development type activities, and try to bring them into the system. And the idea there is that we really do have this ambition or desire to be more flexible and more dynamic in bringing in this expertise. There's always, somebody mentioned, and it was an industry colleague said that the ongoing European Ombudsman inquiry is going to be very negative on scientific advice if the byproduct of that is forced transparency at time of provision of that advice in itself. But we also know that this whole business of onboarding of expertise has to go with a declaration of interest, conflict of interest type openness on the culture. And I think we're pretty happy with that. I think, we can deal with people who are sort of doing active in research, and we can listen to their opinion without them perverting the decision-making process. But we have to do a better job at communicating and explaining that to civil society more generally. Next slide, please. Okay. Then in terms of this dissemination and exchange of knowledge, so we want this two-way street with the academia to develop regulatory training modules and innovation of new medicines, progression from lab to patient. To some extent, I think that's the regulator's duty to try to inform the academic community, and particularly any of these spin-out developments, because there's a lot of that happens there, such that they don't start in a bad direction. And we know there's an awful lot of work to be done in that area there. So that is one sort of approach that we would like to do. And I know in the human area now, they've just been involved in a project called STARS, whereby we want to do this in the clinical trial type area, and it's been fostered under the EU Innovation Network, and that's kicking off literally as we speak the next couple of years. Coming back to what Guido Rassi was saying about horizon scanning, there's an awful lot of people doing this out there, and to some extent then we think that we can leverage, with the academic community and innovation networks, etc., to conduct this horizon scanning and then sort of syndicate that information across the system. And that's of use both in the human, has applications both in the human and in the vet area. And then finally, it's been touched on before, is that we really do want to drive this data sharing culture to foster open science, which is beneficial for all stakeholders. I mean, we crossed a particular Rubicon a couple of years ago when we came out with our policy 70, which was the enforced publication of clinical trials once a marketing authorization has been approved. That was a bit of a battle with the pharmaceutical industry, because they were sort of saying, my God, you're giving away our crown jewels. But we sort of said that once you have used it for its primary purpose, there's a societal interest in actually understanding the data that underpins these risk-benefit decisions of the regulator. And touch wood, to date, the courts have found favour with that type of approach. Now, it's already been touched on today, both in the ERA, the 3Rs discussion as well, that sort of need is there also in the non-clinical area there. And I absolutely believe that once those data are generated, yes, there's concepts of patent protection, data exclusivity, etc. But once they are respected, the idea that they are then never, appear into the public domain, that really is, and then you have this ridiculousness of other companies being asked to essentially repeat the tests, which is in itself a very wasteful sort of situation that really cannot be sustained going forward. And I really think, we really have to look at that collectively. There is a societal expectation upon us as a system, and that is a direction of travel. If we go back over a 20-year time horizon, there is only one way with transparency, and that is up, and we just have got to deal with it and understand, why it's a good thing ultimately to foster that before it's actually made sort of legally imperative, like, for example, with the clinical trial regulation. I think that's largely it. Maybe the last one, go on. That's it. So then I hand over then to my fellow panelists, Jean-Charles kicking off, pass it back then to James, and as I say, Valentin will help me with any Q&A, and I hope, Chair, I've stuck to the time limit so far.
We're perfectly fine.
Hello, everybody. Thanks for inviting the Commission or DG AGRI representative to come to your workshop. It's the first time ever I'm coming to EMA, and I've been working on animal health research for 5 years and even a bit more. So that may ring a bell already about the connection between EMA and research funding parts of the Commission. Today I'm learning a lot. I'm a vet, but I've never worked really on the regulatory aspects of antimicrobial or any medicines or anything like this, except maybe when I was in DG Santé, developing a decision to prohibit the use of antimicrobials to treat poultry flocks that were found infected by Salmonella, and for which I had a negative opinion of another Commission service. I think this would not arise on these days. Anyway, just to inform the people around the table that DG AGRI is co-managing with DG Research implementation of part of Horizon 2020, the EU Framework Programme for Research, Development and Innovation. And we are responsible, chef de file, let's say, for what comes to primary production, agriculture, in a way. So it includes livestock production, and in livestock production, we include animal health and whatever is related to it, animal welfare, etc., etc. So I can give you some insight on what we are doing in Societal Challenge 2 for Horizon 2020, knowing that, I want to insist on this, what we do in Societal Challenge 2, what we've done in FP7, like the glowworm project, is one part of Horizon 2020. If you speak about training of scientists, career development, pure basic research, etc., you have other components of Horizon 2020 where things can be done. There is also the SME instruments. I remember of a project with different stages. I remember of a project for a vaccine development, I think it was a trivalent vaccine for Salmonella control. This was funded at a feasibility study as an SME project. Nothing to do with us, even if we are aware, because we monitor these. What I can say also is, to my knowledge, I may well be wrong, but in the EU projects that I'm following, I don't think EMA is involved. At least not directly, possibly not even indirectly. And I would say that it's a bit different if we consider other agencies like EFSA and possibly CDC, where we have a bit historical contacts with them, and they are sometimes in external advisory boards of these EU-funded projects, etc. And this, I think, EFSA, for instance, is pleased with this, and I guess the projects are reasonably pleased with it. We have a number of projects already in animal health and related matters. If we look at what we will fund, just to give you an idea, you had a workshop on the human health sector, and we say the strategy can be the same. Yes, but the means can be very different. What we will spend in animal health under Horizon 2020 Societal Challenge 2, where we are responsible for, we'll spend around 180 million euros until the end of Horizon 2020 for the 7 years, which is already more than what we spent in FP7, probably 30-40% more, but it's still not that much. I guess this is maybe not even what our colleagues in DG Research dealing with human health are spending only on pure AMR research. So we have to look at this. The projects we cover go from vaccinology and vaccines, and by the way, I mentioned that we have a project, 9 million euros EU contribution for parasite vaccine development, ongoing now. And we will look soon to support also some research to alternative to antimicrobials and this kind of thing. So we have a wide range of activities. What I can say and confess probably is, and this is also something that should ring a bell, is that in the projects we develop, I think the regulatory aspects of medicine, vaccine, or whatever biologicals developments are not really integrated. And I think this is probably linked to the academic community we have. Obviously, more and more on the Horizon 2020, we have industry being part of consortia, and that brings that element progressively in. But I would say the academic community is not this. And they face sometimes some problems. I remember of these projects ongoing on the development of vaccine against helminths. And they said, actually, well, that's what they said, I didn't check, that there was no standards for, let's say, testing, maybe not testing, so the endpoint or whatever of the efficacy of helminth vaccines in animals, in livestock. What would be the threshold to reach 80% decrease, 95% decrease, or whatever? And probably they should have thought about it even beforehand, but that's the situation. To say also on coordination of research, I think I've seen IMI mentioned here. We don't have such public-private partnership in the livestock sector, let's say, or animal health sector. It doesn't mean that we will never have one. Probably we don't have one also because of these budget aspects and the variety of species we have to look at compared to the human health sector with the budget we had. Now, hopefully, we may get a bit more budget into Horizon Europe that may allow something else, but clearly we don't have public-private partnership. We have, however, public-public partnerships. And when it comes to coordination of research programs in animal health in Europe, then we have ERANETs that I will not, if I had time, I could go through them. And hopefully in 2019, we will have a new ERANET coming. But we have also a big project called European Joint Program One Health. That is actually not covering the whole of One Health, but is looking into foodborne zoonosis, mostly epidemiology, diagnostics, and other things. Having as main partners and a balanced representation of the medical sector and the food safety veterinary sector in. So that's why we have this wording One Health. Looking at foodborne zoonosis and AMR. And there it's a system where you have as partners a lot of risk assessment agencies, national agencies like ANSES, which is actually coordinating that European Joint Program. It's a large project with in-kind contribution where the EU is putting 45 million euros. And the partners put 45 million euros themselves. Whether this can be considered as a model for the future, we don't know exactly. Also, as part of the international cooperation, it would be long to describe what it is, but we have a very soft coordination mechanism of animal health research at global level called STARIDA's International Research Consortium, where we have mostly public funders, but we have one big pharma company in. And the idea is to try and identify the gaps for research in animal health in the broad sense, identify gaps jointly, and try to see how the gaps can be filled by research funders according to their own systems, but trying to fill the gaps. Last thing, what we work on, I think it's important to keep in mind that the main focus of our research, the framework of Societal Challenge 2 and even before Thematic 2 in FP7, is mostly livestock. We look at pets when it's an issue of zoonosis, when it's issue of pets being looked as model species or possibly model diseases through pets, but it's mostly about livestock. So there is a limitation to what we could do. Just to maybe to conclude, I would say what we can deliver as support, what you may think is needed for regulatory science, depends exactly of what we mean by regulatory science. EMEA is not the only regulatory agency. I don't know if it's the proper word, but EFSA is also looking at how it can be supported by regulatory science and looking at us on what can be done. Horizon Europe is being discussed. There will be different systems, the budget are there. There will be different forms of partnerships available with different constraints and different opportunities. And certainly, we would welcome with the industry, different types of industry, but at least the pharmaceutical and diagnostic industry, to have a more structured way to work together. You know that with Horizon 2020, there was a lot of focus put on innovation. So basic research is still there, but it's important. It was deemed important that we get products and services on the market. That's why we have more and more projects where we invite the industry to be in. For Horizon Europe, we'll see how things can be developed, but instead of having kind of ad hoc participation of industry in the projects, so the topics that we design, we would like to have more kind of a strategic agreement, networking, partnership with the industry there. So how far we can include all or part of what you have in mind, depending on what you need and what is feasible, we can rediscuss, but I think it would need a separate meeting for that.
Okay. An open opportunity to be developed downstream. Can I hand over to Professor Woods now, who gives his perspective?
Yeah, thank you very much. It's great to be part of this 3 hours process where I've been recycled or reused, I'm not sure. Jean-Charles absolutely identified, I think, a key issue that there was a main one I wanted to bring up, and I think that relates to the fact that the veterinary scientific expertise in the area of regulation is not well established. And I think that it's a deficiency in the system that we operate in. If you look at the other disciplines within veterinary science, within veterinary medicine, within our profession, the veterinary profession, specialization is led through the European Board of Veterinary Specialization. There is a college of veterinary pharmacology and toxicology, which I think is the smallest college within EBVS. It doesn't need to be like that. It can be stronger, but it will require, in order for the veterinary pharmaceutical industry to benefit from the great richness that can come from this, I think some limited investment in capacity building in this area of specialization will be necessary. It's far harder to build from a very small base than it is to build from a wide base. But having said that, residency programs do not need to be that expensive, and can lead to far greater numbers of specialists who can contribute to this field in a cooperative manner. So I put that out there as a great opportunity with a small cost attached to it, where help from the regulators and the industry can make a huge difference. Universities are always interested, and really the second and brief point I want to make, in collaboration in innovative science. And many people who are with interest in this area will know the people that they want to work with in this broad area. I think the area that we are lucky that we have not had to deal with on a very big scale relates to addressing the challenges of emerging infectious diseases. We talk about the fact that a lumpy skin disease has been used as an example a number of times this afternoon. And I think that probably there may be far greater challenges from EIDs that face us and face us as a community, where the risks of not having anything are far greater than some of the other risks as relating to stringent regulation or whatever the other side of that same coin is. And I'm not sure that we still have we're really in a place to address that great challenge today. But I think that's a challenge that we can overcome. But I think most people in this room will have a better, clear idea of how to address those regulatory challenges than I have. But I just want to put it there as what I think is a big potential challenge. And AMR is one example of an emerging infectious disease, but we may have other more orphan diseases that really capture the public attention more than has happened so far. Thank you.
Okay, I can throw it out to the floor in terms of anybody wants to have a question on this area. Please, Nancy.
I'm very happy that we have this session because I think indeed this is a huge potential we haven't used yet. Just a question to Dr. Cavitte. One of the things I think we see is that for some of these challenges, and we need more longer projects. So, for example, if we do a project on disease forecasting, maybe a 3 or a 5 year project is not long enough, and it would be better to have really a sort of a real system in place for a longer period. Is this a possibility under any of the recent frameworks, or?
It's very difficult, not to say. I think more or less the maximum duration of projects so far is more or less 5 years. We have pushed a little bit to get actually the possibility to get longer periods. Whether this will be taken up in Horizon Europe, I don't know, because it's getting very difficult. Even with large budgets, then you have to foresee, then you have to cut the budget into more than 5 years and maybe more. One way might be to go for some infrastructure projects that would need and possibly could go beyond 5 years. But basically for the typical research and innovation projects, or even worse, innovation actions, then basically we plan the topic so that we get a certain result at the end. But for let's say, imagine agroecology, for instance, that we would need projects that have a long period because you need to take stock. But for the moment, we have no obvious solution.
Okay.
Yeah, I would like to briefly comment on that because there's some truth in what you're saying, Nancy. But on the other hand, in the discussions we had when we started preparing for this for regulatory science, I challenged Tony as well and others because I said, it has to be easy to generate ideas on what exactly do we want to do in regulatory science. And Tony, you remember that? I said, if we can't put at least 10 brilliant ideas on the table that will lead to 5-year projects, what are we discussing? And so I think, and that's a challenge for all of us because we've identified a large number of topics today where we feel regulatory science can play a role. And with the presence of Jean-Charles here, we say, okay, possible funding, we have to find the right partners, but it starts with identifying the topics and then asking ourselves the right questions. What do we really want to investigate? And can we draft research plans, or can we come up with questions that would be the foundation for research plans that can indeed include a research topic for 3 to 5 years? And then I would say the next question is, who would then be the right partners, if we can find the funding, who would be the right partners to really work on these topics? And do we do it in public-private partnerships or in public-public partnerships, as has been mentioned? I think that's where I think we should think very strategically in the coming period as well. So for me, the open invitation would be to indeed identify these topics and the research ideas to start developing those research plans. And I understand that for Horizon Europe, that still, we can put topics in there or regulatory science, provided that it's matched properly with the goals of Horizon Europe, that they can still be included in that program. So we should not miss this opportunity, I would say, and really use this opportunity to drive regulatory science forward in a new way. As I said, this session in itself, for me, the most interesting session to see, okay, how far can we take this and how can we really progress it? Because we won't find the resources needed in the network currently if we don't employ this option, this possibility of looking outside, both for the science and for the funding.
Yeah, maybe two things. One to James Wood. As I'm a member of the European College of Veterinary Pharmacology, I have at least to comment here. Yes, it's a very small college, and you are absolutely right. On the other hand, the objective of the college is really linked to pharmacology, and I would say it's, as if I'm correct, there's an extremely small part on regulatory science in there. What doesn't mean that it all comes together in a dossier. That's another question, but I personally cannot see that. On the other hand, we have TOPRA and we have some other organizations where we can still do training on regulatory science, but that's probably not that applied to veterinary sciences at the same time. So I think we have, and there we are coming also to DG AGRI. I'm currently involved in 2 or 3 Horizon 2020 projects to be set up, and to be honest, the discrepancies of probably expectations on the one side on the scientific leaders, and on the other sides on the regulatory side, where you say, okay, yeah, that's great that you want to do in TRL 5 field studies, but can you explain me how you do that under GMP, or where do you get a permission on that? How do you implement that? What's the logic of all that, running these kind of studies, which are purely, I would say, very early research, but then you try to explain what is the normal logic, how you develop such a program as industry, then that often does not fit all together with the criteria then on top set by Horizon 2020, where I am currently involved, and that's really getting very messy. At the same time, project management is then all normally with the scientists because they are driving it. Planning is not paid for obviously, which is the normal system, but it's really difficult. And I think there's also quite a bit of misconception in the whole thing, what is necessary to develop products if you want to go into this kind of a little bit later research. So there are 1 or 2 good ones, but I'm currently also see 1 or 2 quite bad ones.
What I can reply, what can I reply? First, one of the problems is probably if we would have more connections between us, the private sector, the public sector, and would know better the situation, we would probably be in a better situation to define exactly what we can expect from the project, so from the topic we design. When we set a TRL, we don't necessarily know exactly what's the state of play in research. I suppose you mentioned a topic that is currently open for an episodic disease. That's what you have in mind, probably?
This is all alternatives to antimicrobials.
Okay.
They are very innovative. What can also all be an alternative, yes, to be honest.
And this is, so for these ones, the problem is you have people who tell you you will never reach anything in the 20 years coming, and others that claim that in 1 year time there will be a vaccine usable even on wildlife. So we have to find a way without knowing exactly what's going on. So that's the limitation. To come to another one where it's an innovation action, really we think that after a number of years where companies, academics, etc., have worked on different ways, we would like to try and harvest low-hanging fruits. Whether we succeed or not, that's another story. But we are sometimes in a difficult situation to know exactly what is the maturity of different research domains. And that's why, at least personally, I think that a partnership, hopefully public-private, but partnership would enable to have the different key people around the table and knowing what they speak about and having a kind of co-decision, private sector, public sector, the commission, into what needs to be done, how to do it, etc. And from the time perspective, when for our traditional work program, we have work program in the Horizon 2020 that work for 2 years, and we need to design them, 1-2 years before they are published. In a partnership, like in the way, for instance, IMI functions, I think they can organize calls every year. Yeah. So it's speedy. And I jump on this before this meeting closes, just to know how you see, I was seen in the workshop on the human sector. I was seen the IMI as potential resource for what you need in regulatory science in this, because maybe we can extrapolate this or translate this into for the veterinary sector. How could it work? So my question is, I'm personally interested in having an answer to how you see IMI.
I mean, just a very quick answer on that is it was an absolutely vast program, both 1 and 2. We have a dedicated sort of office set up inside this house that coordinated our input. We are a member on their scientific strategic advisory board, that kind of thing. But there's a frustration both inside this agency and across the network that due to resource limitations, we weren't able to engage to the level that we would like, even on the PPPs that were ongoing, because the feeling was that such an engagement would lead to a better outcome. And of course, but that's the past to some extent, and now we want to engage with the future. Horizon Europe is there. Everyone's very excited about that, and we're trying to understand the points of engagement with the Horizon Europe agenda. But the ambition is stated both on the human and I think in the vet area. And indeed, I know our own Guido Rassi is in contact with some, indeed, heads of ECDC, EFSA, to try to maybe coordinate even some sort of more macro level areas of interest that might even be more powerful to come together on, even though we have our own specificities on the pharmaceuticals. There's time for one more question behind, and then I pass over the floor.
Yeah, my wrap-up will be very short.
Yeah, good.
Okay, thank you. So I'm Sven Arnolds from Ghent University, and I want to add maybe some more positive information about academics than Jean-Charles at the beginning. Because I think there's quite some evolution in the last 10 years in several universities, and of which Ghent University is one of them, where we are really stimulated to develop and mature the technologies and go further than fundamental research and add proof of concept to the technologies that we are developing. Universities are investing actively in that. And by that, we are also moving up, and we are indeed confronted with regulatory aspects of the things that we are developing. We are also part of Star Riders, for instance, and I think it's a very good suggestion of Jean-Charles that also EMA could be involved there, because that could be a way also to articulate your needs over there so that they can be considered when the priorities are set for animal health research. When we are doing proof of concept studies and we are maturing, going into field trials even as a university, we are confronted with regulatory affairs. We are also involved in one of these innovation actions, where we ourselves took the initiative to contact a partner that could guide us through the regulatory matter of these things. But also for our own developments, so outside of only with the university funding, we also took the initiative to go, for instance, to the innovation task force here at EMA, or to go to our innovation offices. And I think that the local innovation offices should also be involved in this exercise that you're doing here. But then, as a university, you get this support from the innovation office up to a certain extent. Because if you then put too much questions, if you go too further, then okay, then it stops. And then they say, okay, either you have to create a startup, but sometimes it's too early for us to create that startup already. Then you are an SME, and then you get reduced fees, either you pay the full amount, and that's really not possible. So I think, therefore, some more support for academics could be useful. Thank you.
Excuse me, that's probably a good place to end, and I'll pass over to Ivo for closing, or, sorry, another? You want? And hang on now, guys. I've got Jean-Charles wants a first sort of closing word here and here as well, so ask the two colleagues first, and then close with Jean-Charles.
We've made up time, so let's give them the floor. Now that we have everyone here.
Yeah, I was going to say something about data sharing and transparency. So in the flow of the discussion, if somebody else is better to speak first, I'm fine with that. So.
Okay, no, I just take opportunity of this mentioning a lot of collaboration between industry, universities and regulators. That's something we asked for long and it's never happened because there is some hurdle somewhere. That when we speak of training of regulators, it should be a co-training for regulators, by regulators with industry to be trained and to train. But maybe also for the university. You can't understand the other if you don't know what they do. So if we ask something that you don't know why you don't buy it and why you ask something what we can do it, that's where we start to have some difficulties. So for us, the co-training that we are asking for is something, if you can find a way that we start eventually, this type of thing will be great for that. Better understanding of each other.
Yeah, I wanted to say something about data sharing, transparency, and comparisons to the human sector. Now, in the absence of Rick Clayton, who wasn't able to be here, I have to reiterate that there are many differences between the veterinary and the human sector. And that also goes for transparency. And those of you who have been around for long enough have seen the number of animal health companies diminish. And unfortunately, we have yet another member of Animal Health Europe that is now in a difficult situation. And this has a lot to do with transparency, no, not with transparency, with data protection, to be honest. But that doesn't mean that we as an industry don't reflect on data sharing or on transparency. And actually, within Animal Health Europe, we have currently a very concrete project, and it is about environmental risk assessment, and it is about sharing data, and it's about transparency to the outside world. And that is a specific project team where I am the chair, where we have been discussing and have been bringing proposals to even the Animal Health Europe board, which were then approved by our chief executive officers. So we are really working on ways to be more transparent in the field of environmental risk assessment. We have a couple of ideas and proposals which are, in fact, with the new provisions of the veterinary medicines regulation, achievable without any additional legislation. And you have to remember that Animal Health Europe is not just a club of research-based companies. We have generics under our membership. But I will be happy to invite the other generic association or the members that are not our members to join that discussion. You are welcome, because we are really looking forward to coming up with solutions to that and make sure that all stakeholders can have access to the data they need. So by this, I would like to extend that invitation to Elsa and Dolores here in the room. Thank you.
Yeah, collaborative. Can I just pass the floor now to Jean-Charles before then finally handing it back to Ivo to close the meeting?
No, it was not concluding remarks, anything. But what Sven just mentioned, I think, is an example in one country. There are a few other European countries where this happens, certainly, but not everywhere. Certainly not. Just to say about regulatory science, I think that we have some topics that contribute already to regulatory science. One which was developed actually through a workshop that I organized, the Commission organized with EFSA, about bee health. research, taking stock of a number of projects going on, etc. And we came to the conclusion that the next gap to fill would be to look into pesticides, mixtures in addition with pathogens, etc., with the idea of trying to develop through the project also elements of chronic toxicity, ecotoxicology for bees, and actually not necessarily only honeybees, with the idea that maybe some elements of outputs of this project could contribute to improve the testing schemes or whatever that regulatory agency could then possibly refer to or use or whatever. So at least indirectly we do. Whether we can do it directly, specifically for replying to regulated agencies, probably it needs to be discussed, but certainly something to be investigated.
Well, first of all, let me thank you all for coming here and discussing with us this afternoon in a very condensed way, I would say. In the fields that we have covered in 5 hours of being here, I think it's enormous, all the topics that we have addressed. We set out to discuss regulatory science and use this as a starting point for optimizing our regulatory science strategy until 2025. Regulatory science is the science that we need to do to support good regulatory decisions. And I think we managed to go a long way. I think we also discussed, at least made first steps towards how can we get it organized, because it's not only what is the ambition, but it's more about how are we going to realize that ambition, and looking at funding and partners and ways that we can work together. So very thankful for you all to come here. As said at the beginning of this meeting, we will send out a narrative for consultation. We hope that you will all have the time to work on it whilst we are moving house to Amsterdam. We have a huge challenge in the veterinary area, that's clear, with the new veterinary regulation. I'm happy that we mentioned Brexit only a very few times in this meeting, which doesn't happen that often. And I would like to close the meeting and invite you all for a very modest social event to network after this. So we have some drinks right around the corner. And I think with that, I would say, meeting closed. 5 minutes after time, so.